Hey, it's Mitch Tram. Let's talk about casting without getting a backlash. So, when you look at any bait casting reel, it's going to have 2 or 3 brakes on it typically. You have a magnetic brake like this right here. You have a spool tensioning knob like this right here. And then some reels may have a second brake or only this kind of brake, and this is a centrifugal brake. Centrifugal brake has pins that you pull in or push out. Now the way each of these work, so the centrifugal brake, when you throw the reel and these are engaged, they push up against the spool to slow it down. The more you have engaged, the more braking you have. The magnetic brake, which is this one right here, as you increase the braking level from 0 to whatever the max may be, it moves these magnets that you can see right here closer to the spool, slowing the spool down. I'm going to go ahead and put that back on here. And then the spool tensioner controls how fast the line falls. And the fourth brake is your brake. It's the thumb. And it's incredibly important to have that thumb on the spool. Now, the way these brakes work, the magnetic brake and then the centrifugal brake work at the beginning of the cast. So they slow the spool down when you first cast. The spool tensioning knob slows the spool down at the end of the cast. Alright, we're going to set these in a minute, but first I'm going to talk about why you get a backlash. So why do you get a backlash? You get a backlash because the spool itself is spinning faster than the bait is taking out line. So what can you do to not backlash? Well, the first thing you want to do is set your spool tension, and that needs to be set so that your bait falls at a slow motion. So mine's falling maybe just a touch too fast, so I'm just going to crank this just a touch and try it again. Let me just adjust it with the spool. There we go. So let me try that one more time. Yeah, so there, it's falling at a nice slow rate. Okay, so that's set. Now, if you're just starting out, I would say set your magnetic brake probably around the 7 and 8 range. And then your centrifugal brake, I would start off, if you have one of those, with 3/4 of the pins out. So sometimes you have 4 pins, sometimes you have 6, sometimes there's a knob in there. If you have 4 pins, put 3 out. If you have 6 pins, put 4 out or 5 out. And then your thumb itself, right, that needs to be on the spool when you're casting. And this is the most complicated part because it takes time to learn how much pressure to put on here. But if you set these brakes right here and you set your spool tension, then you're 90% there. The other 10, maybe 20% is managing the spool with your thumb. A couple more tips. Now when you are using a bait casting reel, especially when you're first starting out, don't do these overhead casts, right? The overhead cast is hard to control, and if you don't let it go at the right time, then you end up with like real long hang time with the lure in the air, which causes your spool to overrun, bird's nest, backlash, whatever you want to call it. Or if you let go of it too late, it's going to go straight into the water and you're going to bird's nest. So use a sidearm cast. And have a little tangle, there we go. So use a sidearm cast because really no matter where you let go of it, your bait's going to fly out horizontally, right? And the last thing that I'll say that you want to do is start out with a bait with some weight. And not a ton of weight, but like a 3/8 ounce bait. That's going to be easier to throw than a really heavy bait or a really light bait. So like 3/8 ounce would be a good bait to start with. So say, no backlash. And my thumb the whole time was just barely touching the spool, right? And with my brake set, they control a good portion of the amount of spin spool, or the amount of spool spin, sorry. But then your finger also helps. And you can even feel if this starts to backlash, and you can add a little more pressure with your thumb. And it just takes practice, but knowing how to set your brakes properly makes all the difference in the world. And the last thing I'll mention is wind. If you're casting into the wind, that can really impact your backlashing, right? Because the wind slows the lure down, the spool continues to spin, and you end up with a backlash. So when you're first starting out, set your brakes pretty heavy. Make sure that your spool tensioning is set to where your lure just barely falls, or you could even set it to where it doesn't fall, you know, to where it's falling and you just barely tighten it to where it doesn't fall. Start out with a little bit heavier lure, 3/8 ounce, and try to avoid casting into the wind and use a sidearm cast instead of an overhead cast. And in no time you'll be successful casting a bait casting reel and not getting backlashes.